On December 17, 1944, an American fighter pilot walked into General Douglas MacArthur's command tent on a remote airfield in the Philippines. The pilot was 24 years old. He had just been shot down twice in a single week. His plane was damaged. His engine was leaking oil. Experienced pilots said he was reckless. Senior officers said he had a death wish. But MacArthur shook his hand and pinned the Medal of Honor to his chest. By that moment, Richard Bong, a farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, had already done something no American fighter pilot in history had ever done. He had shot down 40 Japanese aircraft, 40 confirmed kills in a single war, flying a single type of plane. But here's what makes his story incredible. Everyone thought he was insane. His senior officers thought he was reckless. His commanding general thought he was a showman. His fellow pilots thought he had a death wish. They called him crazy for the tactics he used, crazy for the risks he took, crazy for the way he flew his P-38 Lightning like it was an extension of his own body. And they were all wrong. This is the story of how a farm boy's obsession with flying turned him into America's greatest fighter ace, how his recklessness was actually calculated courage, how he broke a record that many believed could never be broken, and how, in the end, his love of flying is what killed him.
His gunnery instructor was Captain Barry Goldwater. Yes, that Barry Goldwater, who would later become a senator and run for president. Goldwater taught Bong fighter gunnery. Years later, reflecting on his time teaching the young Wisconsin farm boy, Goldwater would say something that defined Bong perfectly. "I taught him fighter gunnery. He was a very bright student, but the most important thing, the P-38 check pilot who checked him out said Bong was the finest natural pilot he had ever met." On January 19, 1942, Richard Bong was commissioned as a second lieutenant and awarded his pilot wings. He was 21 years old. He had 595 total flight hours. About 90 of those hours were in the aircraft that would define his life, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was unlike anything else in the sky. Most fighter aircraft of World War II had a single engine. The P-38 had two. It had a unique twin-boom fuselage design with the cockpit in the center. It was faster than almost anything the Germans or Japanese had. It could climb higher. It could dive faster. But it was also difficult to fly. It required precision. It required understanding. Richard Bong understood it like few pilots ever did. In early 1942, after his commissioning, Bong was assigned to the 14th Fighter Group at Hamilton Field near San Francisco. He was supposed to be an instructor, teaching other pilots the intricacies of the P-38, but Richard Bong wasn't the kind of man to stay behind a desk. You see, while stationed at Hamilton Field, something happened that would reveal Bong's true nature. He started buzzing the base. Not just flying low, he was playing. He looped his P-38 around the Golden Gate Bridge. He flew down Market Street in San Francisco so low that people could see the details of his face. He performed aerial maneuvers over the neighborhoods around the airfield. His prop wash blew a woman's clothes off a clothesline in Oakland. She complained. June 12, 1942, Bong's first disciplinary action.
General George C. Kenney, the commander of the base, called Bong into his office. Kenney was a strict officer. Rules were rules. Young pilots who disobeyed them faced serious consequences. Bong stood at attention, waiting for a court-martial, waiting for demotion, waiting for discharge. Instead, Kenney gave him a different kind of punishment. "Lieutenant Bong," the general said, "Monday morning you check this address out in Oakland, and if the woman has any washing to be hung out on the line, you do it for her. Then, when the clothes are dry, take them off the line and bring them into the house." Bong did it. He drove to Oakland. He found the woman's house. He did her laundry. But something else happened during that interaction. Kenny watched the young pilot. He saw something in him that transcended the rule-breaking. He saw a natural flying talent that was almost wasted on teaching other pilots. He saw someone who could be a leader in combat. When General Kenny was selected to lead the 5th Air Force in the Pacific in September 1942, he handpicked 50 of the best P-38 pilots he knew. Richard Bong was #1 on his list. In late August 1942, with just over 595 hours of flight time, Richard Bong boarded a ship for Australia. He had never seen combat. He had never fired his guns in anger. He had 90 hours in a P-38 and a reputation as a hotshot. The other pilots who sailed with him had no idea they were traveling with the man who would become America's greatest fighter ace.
Richard Ira Bong was born on September 24, 1920, in the small town of Poplar, Wisconsin. Not Milan, not Milwaukee. Poplar. Population barely 1,000 people at the time. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where you measured distances in hours of driving, where the horizon was wider than your ambitions were supposed to be. His father was Carl Bong, a Swedish immigrant who came to America with nothing but determination and a willingness to work. His mother was Dora Bryce, Wisconsin-born, a homemaker with the kind of quiet strength that built families in hard times. Together, Carl and Dora had 9 children. 9! Richard was the oldest, and from the very beginning, he was different. While other farm boys talked about taking over their father's operations, Richard talked about flying, not as a hobby, as destiny. He was obsessed, not with airplanes in an abstract way. He didn't just read about them or draw pictures of them. He wanted to feel them, to understand them, to master them in a way that most people reserve for their own bodies. In high school, Bong was a star athlete. He played baseball, he played basketball, he played hockey, he sang in the church choir, he was an honor student. By every measure, he was the kind of boy any Wisconsin family would have been proud of. But his real passion was something else entirely. 1938, Richard Bong enrolls in Superior State Teachers College. The plan was simple: get an education, come back, maybe become a teacher. A respectable path, a normal path. Instead, within 2 years, Richard Bong had discovered the Civilian Pilot Training Program, a government-sponsored initiative that would change his life. A sound of aircraft engines starting. He took his first flying lesson in a Piper J-3 Cub, a tiny fabric-covered aircraft that was barely more than an engine with wings. Most people who took flying lessons did it once and moved on. Bong was different. He soloed in 36 hours. That's not a long time to become proficient enough to fly alone. It's an extremely short time to be good at it. But Bong wasn't just good. His instructor noted something that would become the defining characteristic of his entire life. He was a natural. By 1941, Richard Bong had made a decision. College wasn't the path. Flying was. On May 29, 1941, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program. 1941, May 29th, Bong enlists in Army Air Corps. He was 20 years old. The war hadn't even officially started yet. Pearl Harbor was still months away, but Bong had already recognized that flying would be his life, and that life would soon be tested in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Bong moved through the flight training pipeline, Wausau to Tulare to Taft to Phoenix. Each base added another skill. Primary training in a Stearman biplane, basic training in a BT-13, advanced training in an AT-6 Texan at Luke Field, Arizona. It was at Luke Field where something remarkable happened.
Bong dove. The P-38 accelerated. He pulled up, braking hard left, then right. The Zeros followed, but the P-38 was faster. Bong found a moment of separation and dove again, so low that he later described it as flying 2 inches above the shortest tree in Boona. He pulled up as the Zeros were unable to follow his maneuver. When he returned to Port Moresby that afternoon, he reported 2 kills, 1 Zero and 1 Oscar. 2 enemy aircraft on his first combat mission. The rest of Bong's squadron was shocked. Pilots with dozens of hours of combat experience hadn't accomplished what this 21-year-old kid had done in his first engagement. But more importantly, Bong himself had learned something crucial. He understood now how the P-38 flew, how it responded to control inputs, how fast it could turn, how fast it could dive. He understood its advantages and its limitations, and he understood something deeper. Combat flying wasn't about bravery or luck. It was about precision, about understanding your aircraft better than anyone else. Over the next month, Bong's score climbed rapidly. Another kill, then another. By January, he had 5. By February, he had 10. By March, he had surpassed most of the experienced pilots in the 49th Fighter Group. But the real shock came in April. On April 12, 1944, Richard Bong shot down his 26th and 27th Japanese aircraft. That broke the American record, a record that had stood since World War I, when Eddie Rickenbacker, the legendary American ace, had scored 26 kills.
Bong was 23 years old. He had broken the most storied record in American aviation history. What happened next, however, was not celebration. It was something more complicated. General Kenny, worried about losing his star pilot, pulled Bong out of combat. He was sent back to the United States for a series of press conferences, war bond tours, and public appearances. America's new hero needed to be shown to America. But Bong hated it. He hated the parades. He hated the speeches. He hated being treated like a celebrity. For Bong, flying wasn't about fame. It was about the flying itself, the pure, unfiltered act of piloting an aircraft through hostile skies. In January 1944, after months in the United States, Bong got what he wanted. General Kenny sent him back to the Pacific. This time was different, though. Bong had a reason to fight that went beyond combat. He had fallen in love. Her name was Marjorie Vattendahl, Marge for short. She was a Swedish-American woman from Superior, Wisconsin. She and Richard had met before the war, knew each other back home. But when Richard returned to the Pacific in 1944, that casual friendship became something more. Letters crossed the ocean. Photos were exchanged. Richard told Marge about his missions. Marge told Richard about home. When Richard returned to the Southwest Pacific in January 1944, his first action was to get a photograph of Marge. Then he did something that would make his aircraft famous forever. He renamed his P-38. Instead of a random designation, it now read Marge, with a large photograph of his fiancée painted on the nose. The aircraft became the most famous fighter plane in the Pacific. Pilots from other squadrons would point at Bong's plane and say, "There goes the most sought-after girl in the South Pacific." But the name change was about more than sentiment. It was about what made Richard Bong different from every other fighter pilot. While other pilots were obsessed with their kill counts, Bong cared about flying. While others kept careful tallies of their victories, competing against each other for the highest score, Bong flew because he loved it. Bong would later describe combat flying as fun and a great game that made life interesting. Not a deadly duel, not a tragic necessity. A game, an intellectual challenge that demanded everything he had. And he was winning that game in ways no one had ever won before. When Bong arrived in Australia in late 1942, the American air war in the Pacific was not going well. The Japanese had the advantage. Their pilots were experienced. Their aircraft were well designed. American pilots were being shot down at alarming rates. The strategy was clear. Establish bases, build up air superiority, then push inland. But it was harder in practice than it looked on maps. Bong was assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 94th Fighter Group, a unit flying P-40s, an older, slower aircraft than the P-38.
The P-38s hadn't arrived yet, so Bong waited. He flew the P-40, he trained, he prepared. Then, on December 27, 1942, it happened. Captain Thomas Lynch, another P-38 pilot, was leading a flight of 8 P-38s on a combat mission near Buna, New Guinea. A Japanese naval task force had launched one of its first major coordinated air operations, 40 Zeros, Oscars, and dive bombers attacking American positions. Bong was assigned to fly as wingman to Lynch. As the Vals, Japanese dive bombers, attacked, Lynch's 8 P-38s intercepted them. The sky became a swirling mass of aircraft, tracer fire, and desperate maneuvers. Lynch shot down one fighter, then another Zero moved on him, trying to get on his 6 o'clock position, the most dangerous spot in aerial combat. Bong saw it. Without hesitation, he broke from his wingman position, fired, and the Zero fell away, his target spinning down toward the jungle below. Then 3 more Zeros moved on Bong. He was alone now, separated from the flight. 3 Japanese fighters, all trying to kill him.
This is where a crucial contradiction in Bong's nature revealed itself. Senior officers had called him reckless, crazy, willing to take suicidal risks. But the truth was different. Bong's gunnery accuracy was something his superiors had noted early in his career. When asked about his accuracy, Bong would joke that his gunnery skills were lousy, perhaps the worst in the entire Army Air Force. But the statistics told a different story. Bong had a 91% hit rate. When he aimed his guns at a target, he hit it. When he fired, the enemy fell. How did a pilot with lousy gunnery skills achieve that record? By getting close, incredibly close. Bong's technique was almost suicidal on paper. While other P-38 pilots would attack from distance, maximizing separation and minimizing risk, Bong would fly closer and closer to his targets, sometimes so close that he flew through the debris of exploding enemy aircraft. In one instance, he actually collided with an enemy plane, a collision that he claimed as a probable victory because he wasn't certain the aircraft wouldn't still be flying after impact. This seemed insane, reckless, crazy, but it wasn't. It was calculated. Bong understood the P-38 better than anyone. He knew how close he could get without losing control. He knew the exact distance where his guns were most accurate. He knew how to position himself to give enemy fighters the least possible opportunity to counterattack. He was playing chess at 300 miles per hour, thinking 3 moves ahead, understanding the geometry of combat in a way that his competitors simply didn't. And his competitors were dying. The pilot closest to Bong in the overall kill count was Tommy Maguire. Maguire was aggressive, skilled, and hungry for victory. He had 38 confirmed kills by December 1944, just 2 behind Bong. Maguire was also willing to take extreme risks, and on December 25, 1944, his luck ran out.
Maguire was on a mission over Mindanao when his aircraft suffered engine failure. He bailed out. He was alive, floating down by parachute toward the ground when Japanese soldiers on the ground opened fire. Maguire was killed in combat, not by enemy aircraft, but by enemy ground forces. He died with 38 confirmed kills, 2 behind Bong, the closest anyone would ever get. 2 days later, on December 17, 1944, Richard Bong shot down his 40th Japanese aircraft. 40 confirmed kills. No other American pilot in history had ever done it, not even close. Eddie Rickenbacker had 26. The rest of history had lower numbers. Only Richard Bong had reached 40. When General Kenny heard the news, he made a decision. Bong had flown 200 combat missions, over 500 hours of combat flight. He had been in the air fighting Japanese pilots for nearly 3 years. He had done enough, more than enough. Enough to be considered the greatest American fighter pilot in history. 5 days after his 40th kill, Richard Bong stood before General Douglas MacArthur on an airfield in the Philippines. MacArthur presented him with the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. MacArthur reportedly threw away his prepared remarks and spoke from the heart. Major Richard Ira Bong, who has ruled the air from Mindanao to the Philippines, I now induct you into the society of the bravest of the brave, the wearers of the Congressional Medal of Honor of the United States. At 24 years old, Richard Bong was being recognized as the greatest warrior of his generation. The farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, had become a legend. But like so many legends, his story didn't end with triumphant parades and glory.
By September 1944, the war in the Pacific was accelerating. The American forces were island-hopping their way toward Japan. The Philippines campaign was beginning. MacArthur's grand strategy of returning to liberate the Philippines was in motion, and Richard Bong was in the middle of it all. Bong was no longer flying as a regular pilot. He was now a major, a standardization officer for V Fighter Command. Officially, his job was to train other pilots, to ensure that the Air Force's gunnery and tactical standards were being met. Officially, he wasn't even supposed to fly combat missions anymore. But officially and actually are two different things. In October 1944, Bong returned to the Southwest Pacific for what would be his third combat tour. His orders were clear: fly defensive missions only. Don't seek out combat. If you encounter enemy aircraft, defend yourself and return. General Kenney had already lost too many pilots. He wasn't about to lose Richard Bong. But here's the thing about giving orders to a pilot like Richard Bong. He followed them, technically, legally, but also in a way that interpreted them very loosely. From October to December 1944, Bong flew missions over the Philippines. He flew over Leyte. He flew over Mindanao. He flew over Borneo. Each mission was dangerous. Japanese fighters were still plentiful, still aggressive, still willing to die to take out an American. And Bong still shot them down. 30, 32, 35, 38, 39, 40. Each number represented a human being, a Japanese pilot who thought they would survive that day, who had a family somewhere in Japan, who had hopes and dreams and reasons to live. But Bong didn't think about that in the cockpit. He couldn't. To think about the humanity of the men he was shooting down would be to hesitate, and hesitation in aerial combat meant death. So instead, Bong focused on precision, on technique, on the moment-to-moment calculus of flight and shooting. On August 6, 1945, a historical coincidence of stunning proportions was about to occur. Half a world away, at Hiroshima, Japan, an American B-29 Superfortress carrying an atomic bomb was approaching its target. In a few minutes, it would drop the bomb that would kill over 70,000 people instantly and lead to Japan's surrender. In California, at Lockheed's testing facility, Richard Bong was preparing to fly the P-80 Shooting Star. He had stepped in the cockpit. The engines were starting. The aircraft was moving toward the runway. On August 6, 1945, a historical coincidence of stunning proportions was about to occur. Half a world away, at Hiroshima, Japan, an American B-29 Superfortress carrying an atomic bomb was approaching its target. In a few minutes, it would drop the bomb that would kill over 70,000 people instantly and lead to Japan's surrender. In California, at Lockheed's testing facility, Richard Bong was preparing to fly the P-80 Shooting Star. He had stepped in the cockpit. The engines were starting. The aircraft was moving toward the runway. In January 1945, Richard Bong was sent home. General Kenney's orders were specific. Go home, marry Marge, start thinking about raising a lot of tow-headed Swedes. You've done enough. Bong arrived in the United States a hero.
He was the ace of aces, the man who had shot down more enemy aircraft than any American in history. The newspapers covered his arrival, radio stations played interviews with him. The public wanted to celebrate him. The military wanted to parade him. Bong wanted to get married. On February 10, 1945, in Concordia Lutheran Church in Superior, Wisconsin, Richard Bong married Marjorie Vattendahl. The wedding was attended by 1,200 guests, not bad for a town the size of Superior, and covered by international press. Marge wore white. Richard wore his dress uniform, his medals gleaming. They looked at each other with the kind of love that feels like a promise of better days ahead. For a few months, Richard Bong lived a normal life. He and Marge settled in California. He accepted a position as a test pilot with the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. The war was winding down. Germany had surrendered in May. Japan was on the brink. Life was supposed to get easier now. But Richard Bong couldn't stop thinking about flying. Test piloting was his new mission, his new challenge. The war was essentially over. Japan's defeat was inevitable, only a matter of weeks or months away. But new aircraft were being developed, new technology, new challenges. Lockheed was developing a new jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, a revolutionary aircraft with capabilities that conventional propeller-driven planes couldn't match. Bong wanted to fly it. A full-size P-38 Lightning sits outside the memorial, a permanent tribute to the young man who loved flying more than anything else in life. But perhaps the most important thing that happened wasn't a memorial. It was a change in how people understood Richard Bong. The officers who had called him reckless reconsidered. The pilots who had thought he had a death wish studied his combat tactics and realized how calculated they were. The commanders who had worried about his safety recognized that his apparent suicidal diving attacks and close-range passes were actually the products of masterful understanding of his aircraft and his opponent. Richard Bong wasn't crazy. He was brilliant. And his brilliance was matched only by his love of the art of flying. In later years, General George Kenney, who had recognized Bong's talent and mentored him throughout his career, wrote an entire book about him, Dick Bong, Ace of Aces. In it, Kenney argued that Bong represented something that transcended simple aerial combat statistics. Bong represented the perfect marriage of talent, dedication, and passion. He was the right man, in the right place, at the right time, with the right mindset to excel at his chosen profession. When you look at those numbers, they're almost incomprehensible. 40 victories, 200 missions. That means Bong had to succeed at a rate of 1 victory per 5 missions against Japanese pilots who knew how to fight, against anti-aircraft fire, against the physical and mental strain of combat flying. Most pilots would consider getting through 200 missions without being shot down a success. Bong flew through 200 missions and destroyed 40 enemy aircraft in the process. His medals tell the story. The Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross twice, the Air Medal 14 times. Enough hardware to demonstrate that military bureaucracy recognized what Bong was doing in the sky. But to those who flew with him, knew him, and watched him fly, the medals were almost irrelevant. They knew they had been in the presence of greatness. Richard Ira Bong lived for 24 years. He spent 27 months in combat. He shot down 40 enemy aircraft. He received the Medal of Honor. He married the woman he loved. And he died doing what he loved most, flying. The pilots who said he was crazy were technically correct. Richard Bong was not a normal person. Normal people don't have the kind of drive that takes a farm boy from rural Wisconsin and makes him the greatest aerial combatant in his nation's history. But crazy isn't the right word. Obsessed, maybe. Dedicated, certainly. Brilliant, absolutely. What made Richard Bong different was that his passion wasn't for glory or fame or rank. His passion was for flying.
He loved the P-38. He loved understanding it, mastering it, pushing it to its limits and beyond. When he was in the air, hunting Japanese fighters across the vast Pacific, he was home. He was doing the thing he was born to do. The farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, proved that obsession, combined with talent and dedication, can transcend normal limits. He showed that one person flying one aircraft can change the course of history. And he did it all by doing what he loved. Richard Bong died on the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, one of history's greatest aviators taken from the world in a test flight accident. But his record stands, unmatched, unbreakable, a testament to a farm boy from Wisconsin who looked at the sky and decided he would master it.
When the 5th Air Force heard the news that Richard Bong had been killed, something remarkable happened. Officers who had flown with him, who had known him, who had admired him, they wept. One report from that day captures it perfectly. Right then, I stopped thinking of the atom bomb which had wiped out Hiroshima that morning. Wherever I landed, I found that the whole 5th Air Force felt the same, that we had lost a loved one. That's why each of us got a lump in our throats when we read that telegram about his death. Major Bong, ace of American aces in all our wars, is destined to hold the title for all time. And that prediction proved true. In the 80 years since Richard Bong's death, no American fighter pilot has come close to his record of 40 aerial victories. Modern air combat, fought with missiles and radar rather than guns and visual range, operates under completely different rules. The era of the fighter ace, the individual pilot flying one-on-one duels at high speed, ended with World War II. Because of that, Bong's record is essentially unbreakable. There will never be another 40-victory American ace. There might not even ever be another 25-victory ace. So Richard Bong holds a record that will almost certainly stand forever. Across Wisconsin and America, memorials were erected to honor Bong's memory. The airport in Superior, Wisconsin was renamed Richard Bong Airport. A high school memorial room in his hometown of Poplar displays his uniform, all of his decorations, photographs, newspaper clippings, and even a fragment of the P-38 he flew in combat.